February 11th, 2013. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. I'm joined by the Honorable Mitchell Englander, and we expect we'll be having the other members joining us shortly. We'll be taking general public comment prior to the discussion of today's agenda items. If anybody would like to offer general public comment, please fill out one of the white public comment cards and bring it forward. Have we received any cards yet? Is there anybody who is in the process of filling out a general public comment card? If so, please raise your hand. All right, so seeing none, we'll go ahead and close general public comment. Mr. Englander, item number 3, the continuation of the CAO encumbrances report, I wanted to propose as a item as a consent item, but I understand there's a technical change
that is correct. So item 3 is continued from our last meeting on February 4th, is a CAO report relative to recommendations regarding prior year encumbrances and the proposed general fund encumbrance policy. We did meet with CD12 and go over the information, and we would like to offer one additional recommendation, and that is that the CAO make available to the mayor and council encumbrance data prior to the automatic reversion.
That seems fine, and with your consent, Mr. Englander, we'll go ahead and move that as a consent item. We'll take a formal vote on that, or I guess when we get a quorum here. So that brings us to item number 1.
Item number 1 is a CAO report relative to the mid-year financial status report for 2012-13.
Good afternoon. Emily Maeda with the Office of the CAO.
Good afternoon.
Just to start off, there were a couple of technical corrections that a revised attachment 3 and 4 should have been distributed to you.
Okay, yes. Do you have those, Mr. Oh, yes, we have those.
Okay, so the first FSR projected a deficit of 16.6 million. This report now projects a deficit of 9.6 million. That primarily consists of a shortfall of 5 million in the fire department's constant staffing overtime account and a $3.7 million shortfall in the city attorney's outside counsel account. The police department is no longer projected to have a deficit. It is recommended that 3.7 million be transferred from the Attorney Conflict Panel Fund to the UB outside counsel account to address the city attorney shortfall. This will reduce the deficit to 5.9 million. Recommendations in this report total 96.8 million and include reauthorizing 22.4 million in MICLA for a fire station alerting system, a fire computer-aided dispatch system, and the purchase of 144 non-black and white vehicles for the police department. General fund receipts through December are 55.9 million ahead of plan. As reported in the first FSR, property, documentary transfer, and hotel tax revenues are ahead of plan. The utility users tax, power revenue transfer, and franchise income are below plan. There is also continues to be uncertainty about the 23.6 million expected from AB 678. Departmental receipts are projected to be short by 15.2 million by year end. This includes an 8.9 million reduction in related cost reimbursements from the Solid Waste Resources Fund and the Sewer Capital Maintenance Fund due to high vacancy in the departments, in the Bureau of Sanitation. Surpluses can be used to offset departmental receipt shortfalls and mitigate the impact of not receiving AB 678. The reserve fund balance will be 229.2 million or 5.04% of the adopted general fund budget. This assumes the recommendation to transfer 15 million from the reserve fund to the budget stabilization fund is approved.
So, I'm sorry, assuming that transfer is approved, the percentage of general fund would be what number?
5.04%.
Okay, thank you. What was the last time that the reserve exceeded 5%?
That I do not know.
So for that, actually, That's one of the graphs we had in the other report that we submitted, and it's up.
I know, I noticed.
So let me just find that for you.
It was a decade ago.
Yes, it was. It's more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Although we did end the year above 5%, that's June 30th, 2012. We shortly thereafter went below the 5% because of reappropriations that were done from the reserve fund to begin the fiscal year. But as of February 1st, 2013, we were right above the 5% threshold, and before any transfers are made, as recommended in this report, we're at 5.37% of the general fund.
Which would be the highest percentage that it's been in recent memory.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Maeda. Go right ahead.
That's okay. That's the end of my summary.
All right.
I've got a series of questions.
And we're joined by Mr. Rosendahl. Mr. Rosendahl, welcome. Why don't we do this? Are they department-specific questions or are they general questions? Because
Combination is just a quick list.
Okay, so what we've done in the past is we've typically gone through to have each member say which departments they want to ask questions of, and then if we've gone through all the departments or if we've gone through all the members and there are no questions as to other departments, then they can just go ahead and go back to work and we don't have to leave them sticking around. So
I agree.
why don't we go ahead and do that? And I see a lot of eagerly nodding heads in the audience, so why don't we go ahead and use that technique again today. So Mr. Rosendahl, if you just want to run through the departments that you have specific questions
John,
about.
you want to come over for that?
Okay, and while he's doing that, why don't we go ahead to Mr. Englander, if you can.
My department?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got questions for LAFD, LAPD, and LAPD is a very quick question, so we can take them first if need be. Emergency homeless shelters, I've got a question on that. Cultural affairs, neighborhood empowerment, and the zoo. And those are very quick questions, Mr. Chair, most of them.
All right, I'm sorry, could you run through them one more time for me? LAPD.
LAPD, LAFD.
LAFD.
I got a question on the emergency homeless shelters, cultural affairs, neighborhood empowerment, and the zoo. About 400 questions to the CAO.
Okay. All right, and I
So don't
think
go anywhere.
my questions would be included in that list with the exception of the city attorney. I'd like to add to the list. And Mr. Rosendahl, we have LAPD, LAFD, homeless shelters, cultural affairs done, the zoo, and the city attorney's office so far. Are there other departments that you would like to add to the list?
Nope.
Okay. Well, then if you are here, if you are here for any department that I didn't just mention, get out while the getting's good.
Great.
Thank you all very much for your time and coming down, and thank you for your good work.
And CLA. If CLA can stay as well, please.
All right. Now, in return, please exit quietly in return for that favor. All right, Mr. Rosendahl, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, John, come on over. Don't be shy. First, for those of you who know my Laura McClellan, she gave birth to another baby boy
Oh,
Sunday morning.
congratulations.
At 1:08 in the morning, she delivered another priceless jewel to all of us. So she normally would be here with me. Other matters took her away.
Well,
Send them a voter registration card.
So with that, I think the first one was city attorney, which is on page 18.
well, I think
Or you want
members might have some general questions too, I'm not sure, but,
I do not. Mine are very specific and they're quick.
okay. All right,
Okay, here are my questions.
ready to go?
Aside from the recommendations you have laid out, what other options do we have for increasing the budget stabilization fund?
Well, so in the report, we have a recommendation to move $15 million from the reserve fund to the budget stabilization fund. That's a recommendation we're making because we believe that not only will we stay at the 5% reserve fund threshold in the reserve fund, the $15 million that we're recommending will allow us to in essence, start filling the hole that we have for next fiscal year. And that's the $260 million deficit we have. So one of the things that is still pending from our office to this committee and to City Council is a policy on the budget stabilization fund, and that would be how in the future deposits and withdrawals from the fund will be made. So something that's going to be established by ordinance going forward. Before we have that policy in place, so we know that we have a hole to fill next year, and in essence, we're looking for anything we could find, any savings we could find, and any additional revenue that may come in this fiscal year to transfer into the budget stabilization fund. So this is a revenue that actually came in that was due last year. It came in this year. It was moved to the reserve fund, and that's why we're making that recommendation, because it's revenue above and beyond what was expected this fiscal year.
Great, thank you for that.
If I may just add on into that, Councilman Rosendahl, with approval of the encumbrance report, another option would for council would actually move some of that money into the budget stabilization fund, and certainly as Ben mentioned, we are projecting revenue be above in some categories, and certainly if we don't have a need to offset AB 678 or any other shortfalls, we'd be looking to tap some of that money to put into budget stabilization fund as well.
Sure, that makes sense. Can you please go into further detail regarding the nature of the separate service protection account that is within the budget stabilization fund?
So we have the budget stabilization fund. What we wanted to do to signify that we wanted to use any funds for service protection for next year, we had in a prior financial status report asked that a separate account be established within the budget stabilization fund, and that's referred to as the service protection account. So that is to basically show that what we're trying to do this year is put away enough money in that account to, in essence, save services for next fiscal year. So our intent is to make recommendations in this financial status report and in future financial status reports to, in essence, save away dollars in that account for the sole purpose of being used for next fiscal year.
Good. Could the rating agencies view a drawdown of the budget stabilization fund from a similar perspective of using the reserve fund to close the budget gap?
When rating agencies view our in essence, what we have as a fund balance, they do look at the reserve fund as one. They look at our unappropriated balances as another source of fund balance, and I'm sure they'll look at the budget stabilization fund as yet another source of a fund balance. But as far as the creation of these funds, we have created the budget stabilization fund for the sole purpose of using kind of one-time funds to plug a hole for next fiscal year, and because that is the intent, and it's a separate fund from the reserve fund, we feel that there won't be as negative a look as it would have been if we were just transferring from the reserve fund for services.
Good. Have the bond rating agencies given the city of Los Angeles credit for being one of only two cities, Denver being the other, that has set aside more than 50% of the costs for retiree health care obligations?
Bond rating agencies have made that note in terms of their reviews of our ratings, but there's multiple factors that go into the ratings, and so that's just one of the items. The other items to look at is the status of our reserve fund, obviously. They look at our projected revenues, they look at our expenditure trends, and so there's a number of different factors that go into it, but that is one, and it has been noted in the last ratings we received from at least Fitch and others.
Good. If the proposal to eliminate or limit the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds moved forward in Congress, what kind of impact could we have at the cost of borrowing? Would this apply to current issuances or just those going forward?
You know, it kind of depends on what's the outcome at the federal level, whether
Yeah.
they look backwards.
Yeah.
Certainly, if they look backwards, it's going to, everything that we've already issued is going to make it much more expensive and really limit the secondary market, you know, as people basically buy and sell those things. On a go-forward basis, we know it's going to have an impact, and it's going to raise the cost of borrowing anywhere from 100 to 200 basis points, meaning 1% to 2%. Essentially, if we lose this tax exempt status, it's going to really limit us, and in essence, almost cut off some of our availability to go to the market and actually fund infrastructure projects. It is really going to have a really huge impact on us going forward with projects. And notwithstanding the increased costs in our debt service, if we actually get out there to the market.
If I could add on to that,
Please.
Councilman, the part that's
Your
most...
name for the record.
Miguel Santana, CEO. What's most concerning about the proposal is that it essentially is transferring the tax burden from the federal government to the local government, because the city will still have a responsibility to maintain its infrastructure and to continue building fire stations and rec and parks facilities, as well as issuing, debt for cash flow as we do every year. So that responsibility will be more expensive, freeing up the federal government, providing additional revenue from the federal government, but basically making the cost for Angelenos much higher.
And my last comment, and thanks for letting me do this, Mr. Chair. Every year, it seems, we don't budget enough for petroleum products, and even the unappropriated balance, the UB, set aside doesn't seem to be enough. What do you attribute to this particular deficit?
That was the case up until this fiscal year, I believe. This fiscal year, with working with General Services Department and the Mayor's Office and the Council, we believe budgeted enough between the department and the funds we have in the unappropriated balance to cover the cost of petroleum for this fiscal year. So that's what the department has stated as far as being able to manage with the dollars that they have been provided within their own budget, and those dollars in the unappropriated balance that have been earmarked for petroleum. But obviously, that is a very economically driven commodity that, as we're seeing now, prices increase tremendously, 15 cents, I think, in the last week. It's something that we always have to monitor and budget accordingly.
Yeah, what about the fleet production? Is there something we can do internally to deal with it
Excuse me, with
in the reduction?
in the reduction of...
The fleet reduction we're doing
fleet
now.
reduction. I mean,
Costs.
fleet reduction has been an ongoing, initiative in the city, going at least the last 6 years. There's been a number of requests made by the mayor's office for departments to right-size their vehicles, so to speak. Why do we need certain larger vehicles when a sedan may be sufficient? So that's been one initiative. Other initiative has just been the turning in of vehicles per instructions from the mayor and council. So those have been some initiatives that have been in place for the last several years.
Yeah.
I think the problem always comes to whether departments are able to actually give up those vehicles based on the service needs that they see. But fleet reduction has been an ongoing initiative, and if the department is still here, I'm not sure if they are, but they could probably speak a little bit more about that one.
Very good. Now, look, in the Budget Committee, we're here, and this morning I was in TCT, Trade and Commerce, and the airport people brought up a savings of 18% in their paper use by Xeroxing it and coordinating. I said to them, are you coordinating with the harbor, DWP, and the city of LA, so we're all on the same wavelength, and we can consolidate our paper needs, the IT issue? Are you looking at that? I want them to report back with all of the other groups, because we had a discussion in this committee of tying all the IT together when it comes to Xeroxing and all these other things. The airport did 18% on their own. Have they been in any way discussing a strategy of IT for all of us?
For information technology needs, there
Well,
is,
just to get rid of, we want to get rid of Xerox machines, we want to get rid of, we don't want to have duplication of material. We wanted to get all of that so we could have efficiencies and save money.
I would say, yeah, IT has been looking at some of these issues over the last several years.
Yeah.
And one thing that this leads into is sort of the strategic advisor going forward, really looking at where we want to go with our IT infrastructure, really what we should be focusing on. And I know a report will be forthcoming within the next couple of months. But yes, to answer your question, yes, we have a new GM
Right.
who's really taking a fresh look at IT and what's going on in the city. And we expect to really make some changes moving forward.
Good, and I look forward to tying that in so that in that committee, I told them we need to tie it up and get it to budget, and we'll see what kind of funding. So if you could kind of dip into that conversation of this morning. Great. Done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendahl. And just to follow up on one of Mr. Rosendahl's questions, because the petroleum issue has been, I think, a source of a lot of attention from folks. And I guess what I want to be clear on is this is obviously an extremely volatile global marketplace. And from month to month, no one, consumer or government alike, has any idea what gas prices are going to do next month. I just want to be clear and make sure that whatever we are assuming as a sort of a blended annual per gallon price for our petroleum use in any given budget year is pegged to a best practice of some kind. For example, whatever the federal government or the state government or private industry is assuming in their budgets as the annual cost of petroleum. Because it's clearly the case that this is a budget assumption that has a wide range of a big margin of error, because we don't know what's going to happen with that fluctuating marketplace. But it seems to me that we want to make sure that it's a fair estimate, that assumption is a fair estimate, and to me, that would be best determined by how comparable it is to what is estimated or assumed in other government entities' budgets. So can you talk to how that's done? How do we come up with the budget assumption for the anticipated price of gasoline for a given year?
It'd be...
Sorry, is that a GS? Is that,
yeah, I was going to say it'd be best if GSD looks at that. I know there's a number of factors that go into the estimate. Obviously, where we think the market's going to be, it's going to be based on the mix of vehicles. As we're changing out from diesel, going to clean fuel, there's a cost to that, and so that changeover in fleet is being...
That part can be measured. I mean, we know how many vehicles we have, we know what they are, and so on. It's the per gallon price that is where the volatility is. And the per gallon price is based on an international marketplace. So it seems to me that, we should be consistent with what other government entities are doing in estimating the per gallon price. That's what I'm saying. I just want to make sure that we are. So if we don't, I shouldn't have probably let GSD go before I hadn't had that answer. But I guess I would just like to make sure that, and I would ask that we verify that in fact our estimates for the per gallon price of fuel is consistent with the estimates that are made by the state of California and the federal government. Let's just leave it at that.
That's fair.
Ask them to bring that information to council when this...
Yeah, and actually that's a good point. Why don't we, when we bring this back to council, if we could just have that report, I'm pretty sure I know that the answer is yes, but I just want to make sure, because this is a question that's frequently asked. It's always an issue that the press wants to talk about. It's unfair to ask any budgeting agency to predict the price of gasoline. No one would ever expect that. But I just want to make sure that our predictions and our estimates are consistent with what others are doing as well. Okay. Mr. Englander?
Thank you. LAPD was just a quick question, which was on the MICLA financing of, I believe it was for the,
So while you're looking, let's ask the department to come on up. LAPD, please.
well, it says here 144 non-patrol vehicles, but then it was also an approval, I believe, for the MDCs. And how many MDCs?
They're going to be able to purchase an additional 95 on top of the 300 that were included in this year's budget. So that's based on additional funding from the 911 fund as they close it out.
And those 95 are part of, those are for the black and whites, I'm assuming.
Correct.
And those 95 were part of what was approved in this year's budget for the 140, I'm trying to remember how many black and whites we purchased this year.
Over the black and whites included this year.
45 or something, well, whatever it was.
Yeah.
That's part of that? Because there's more than 95 black and whites that we purchased this year.
Yeah. Correct. This was because the department asked, I'm sorry, Anne Marie Sauer with the CAO. The department had asked for an additional 220 replacement MDCs in the 13-14 budget, and because we don't know that there will be funding available, but there is funding now, that was why we were recommending using the closeout funds this year to be able to purchase those, since the funding is available.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's what I couldn't figure out. I think that's all I had for PD. Anybody else? PD?
Any other questions on LAPD, Mr. Rosendahl?
No, just good luck in the situation we're in right now.
I just wanted to confirm out loud that, given the fact that we had originally scheduled a number of civilian positions for potential layoff, and those layoffs were abated, I guess, the department is still operating within budgetary projections, notwithstanding that fact, number one, and that all of the expenses associated with the consolidation of the Office of Public Safety are also within budgetary projections. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I'd just like to do a shout out to you, because when you let every one of those people speak and explain what critical value they were to the department and to our safety, I went on record in a very strong way pointing out that we have to find a way to move things around so that civilians are doing civilian jobs and officers are doing a small job. Your leadership is incredible, and we've all benefited from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendahl. I think that everybody who works for the city is doing really important work. We just have to figure out whether we have an opportunity to pay for them, and I'm very, very pleased that the department has been able to do that. You wanted to add something?
I'm looking, okay. I guess I would just say yes to both of those, but the caveat would be, obviously, we have this extraordinary situation that has occurred, so the department is obviously going to no longer, I guess, finish the year in budget as we deal with the FLSA-related overtime issues, and we don't know how long this incident will go on.
Of course. And I didn't want to have a whole, discussion about that now. I think we all understand that
Right.
that is an extraordinary circumstance that is going to entail extraordinary expense,
Okay,
and I'm
good.
sure we'll be having further conversations about that, but I don't think this is the time for it, so.
You did bring up, real quick, you did, if I could, the OPS, and there was a report on that. That should cover all the expenses, or do we anticipate additional ones in the next FSR?
No, the OPS costs that are included here, it reimburses GSD completely, and LAPD, again, as planned, is living within the resources for the consolidation.
Excellent.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Englander, I kind of took us off of our usual procedure, which was to go department by department. So we finished with LAPD.
Yes.
So,
That's why-
Mr. Serrano, you had mentioned city attorney first, and I see we have the city attorney's representative here, so why don't we go back to city attorney, and then we'll just
I
go
was just
through
going to
it.
go alphabetical, but
Yeah, I think
I'll leave it up to
that's probably
your
the way to go.
direction.
And we won't keep you here long, Pete. I just had a kind of a really, I think, small point that I wanted to raise, which was that there was a projected slightly over $1 million surplus in the salary accounts because of attrition and of course, furloughs. But there there's a deficit projected of almost 4 million for outside counsel.
Yes.
And I understand that, it's my understanding that most, if not all, of that deficit is due to the very large, high-profile litigations that the office is involved in, the high-impact litigation, if you will, that are very specialized. Is that right, or is it the case, and to what extent is it the case, that because we are having fewer hours put in by actual city and deputy city attorneys, that there is an increased need for outside counsel for routine litigation costs?
It's a little of both, but essentially the 3.7 million identified is the cause of these extraordinary cases.
Okay.
The utility users tax, the phone tax litigation, and the Willets case. They're the two that are taking a lot of that. The discovery in the ADA cases has been just tremendous, a tremendous amount of effort that has had to be put in by outside counsel on that case as well, and we just didn't have the resources to put into it ourselves. There is some, I think we're just from at the professional level in the office where I see what our lawyers are actually doing and what they can do, given the kind of time that they do put in, and I would say our litigators in particular, other lawyers as well, but our litigators in particular are not taking their furlough hours as leave time. They are working. They're here nights and weekends. I come in occasionally, more often than I even care to admit on weekends, and invariably the security guard at the shed there coming in asks me if I'm going to the 6th or 7th floor, which is where our litigators are. They know where the litigators are, and they always ask me whether I'm going to that floor or not. No, I'm going to 8. A few others of us work on the weekends as well. So, but we are at a point where our lawyers are not able to cover everything that needs to be covered, and so a little bit of that expense may in fact be due to overflow rather than the specialized expertise that we need of these heavy cases right now. But that's the 3.7 is pretty much that.
Okay. Very good. And that really is because those are highly specialized areas of practice that we really wouldn't expect our own litigators to have to be able to build up sufficient expertise to be able to.
It is, yes. And in those areas, it's both the specialized expertise and, as I say, in discovery, we might be able to put in, because we assign attorneys to be, in some cases, the contact with the outside counsel, in other cases, to be support to them as well. You may know, for example, in the redistricting cases, we've had several attorneys working on the redistricting cases along with outside counsel in those cases. So it varies.
Which
try to
helps reduce costs.
Absolutely. And we try to do that as much as possible. In the Willets case, the discovery, normally we would have attorneys work on the discovery, not exclusively, but to a large extent, so that's an area that more or less is fungible for attorneys to handle. It's just so massive that we have not been able to do that.
Okay. All right. Anything else for the city attorney, colleagues? All right. Thank you very
so much.
Appreciate it. Where does that bring us?
Next would be Cultural Affairs.
Cultural Affairs. Mr. Englander.
Yes, thank you. Cultural Affairs, I had thought we had avoided the possibility of a deficit because we were supposed to ensure the department was self-sufficient on TOT, and so I'm trying to figure out what happened there. Did something change?
Oh, Emilio Rodriguez with the Administration Division over at Cultural Affairs. The deficit is really largely an issue with between accounts, alignment of the accounts. We're running short on as-needed count, mostly because, the regular staffing has been reduced since 07-08 from roughly 80 regular positions to 41. The as-needed account hasn't been fully ramped up to compensate. There was some expectation to partner out some of the facilities over the near and long-term future. That hasn't quite caught up yet. So in the interim, we're Some of the solutions we're looking at are basically within budget, within our Fund 480 special fund budget. And we'll be coming forward in a future FSR to make those adjustments.
So if I could ask the CAO to weigh in on that as well, because it's about $500,000, I believe, and trying to figure out what needs to be done so we're not looking at that number again in another 3 months. What are some of the items that are holding that up?
Elena Sanchez, Office of the CAO. The department has been looking at it's a completely special funded department, and they may have some prior year encumbrances and things that they're trying to release, which would give them more cash to make these adjustments in their budget. We've been talking to them, and they're saying that they can fund these as-needed salaries through their own budget this fiscal year. It's just a matter of them going through their special fund and releasing some encumbrances and moving some funds around.
And that's being done now?
Yes, it is.
What's your time frame to get that completed?
Because encumbrances, releasing some of these encumbrances would require council approval to reappropriate. We anticipate coming back when council considers a next financial status report. I'll be working with CAO staff on the timeline. If not, we will come forward separately on that.
Right, okay, thank you.
All right, and we've been joined by Mr. Kretz. Colleagues, anything further for Cultural Affairs?
I just want to be
Mr. Rosendahl?
clear. 1% of a development project should go to cultural affairs, correct? Or some form of give back, 1%?
Correct.
Are you able to keep track of the development projects that owe us the 1%, have given the 1%, so we could see an actual list of who's done what and who we should encourage to do more? Do we have a list like that?
I believe so. I'd have to work with our program manager for the Arts Development Fee Program.
Because it's critical for me to know in my district, as I'm sure all my colleagues, the same thing, as to what exactly is happening in the district at this moment, what has happened to the 1% or hasn't happened to the 1%, and how do we get, our energy around it. That's all.
Yeah, we do maintain an active listing of projects. I'll convey that to our program manager.
Perfect.
Work with your staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
In fact, if I could add to that, thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
We'd spend a lot of time over the years monitoring and trying to work with that 1% arts fee, and it's very restrictive in terms of what you can and can't do.
Right.
We had some amendments that were held in committee for some time a few years ago, Mr. Smith did, and we used to get regular reports, and I think they were quarterly from the department on those, and I don't believe I've seen one in quite some time. So if we could go back to either regular reports, if they're quarterly or biannually, it'd be very helpful for the council offices to get. Biannually probably makes enough sense to do that. If that doesn't generate too much work, it'd be very helpful.
Sure, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. That brings us to fire?
Fire.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, so if we could have the fire department next, please. And okay.
I can't hear you, Johnny. For this item? Okay, give me them.
Okay, first, before we begin with questions, maybe someone could just give an overview to the revision that we have to the FSR here relating to the fire department that's been distributed to the members.
Certainly, Council Members. Salvador Martinez, Los Angeles Fire Department. What you have in front of you is a technical correction we're requesting to address an update that we received on our reimbursements from some UASI grants. We anticipated a higher reimbursement of 126. It didn't materialize. So since it was over the 100,000 threshold, to make any corrections to our reversion worksheet, we needed approval of council. This is similar to the request that LAPD made in terms of a similar reduction on their request. Fortunately, we didn't get our request into the CO in a timely manner, and
I
that's
see.
why we're asking for it in this manner, sir.
Okay. Mr. Englander, you want to start off on fire?
Certainly. Thank you. First, on the worksheet itself, and the spreadsheet that was just submitted to committee moments ago, it also has in here the pending reimbursement from DWP by year end. And I know there was some concern and questions about that in terms of waiting for a legal response. If it was legal, I think there was a lot of questions pending a legal opinion. Have we gotten a legal opinion yet?
No, we're still waiting for a legal memo from the DWP city attorney.
And what's the, pending the legal outcome of that, what is the,
Right here, Lenny, is perfect.
what's the information sharing on the legal opinion? When will that be submitted to this committee to find out what the outcome was?
My understanding, he's still completing his legal research on the matter.
And then the updated special fees, service fees, the $675,000, was this just something that was just approved recently?
It was adopted by council in September, and it became effective in October. The ordinance became effective in October.
So this is already in effect, and so this is what's anticipated for the rest of the fiscal years, the 675 balance, based on that? And then on the pre-inspection service for daycare facilities as well, that was a little more recent, was it not?
I think that became effective in November.
As well, yes.
Was that
And that 20,000 represents our projected revenue for the remainder of the year.
So if those were done in November, the 675 and the 20,000, that's the balance for the rest of the year. Has there been an increase year-to-date on those particular items? Or are we still anticipating to initiate the work?
The work has been initiated. That was based on our projections that the 675 and 20 would be the total that we would receive in this fiscal year, sir.
So all the work on both of those items have been initiated?
Yes, sir.
And on the increase in appropriations for the installation of communications equipment in the fire department vehicles, what specifically, can you address what those are?
This is Mark Davis for CAO. That's for the communications going into the fire trucks, the ambulances, that's put in by ITA. So we're transferring the $130,000 to them to put in the communications.
And is that for new vehicles?
Yes.
PD did as well?
Yes.
That's part of the new fleet?
The new vehicles.
Got it. It didn't indicate that. And then if you could just walk us through the $12 million municipal, the MICLA financing to replace the fire computer-aided dispatch system and what's going on with that. Is that something we anticipate being online by the end of the fiscal year?
The department has been working on the RFP, and the RFP is under review by the city attorney's office before it can be reviewed.
So the RFP is not out yet?
No, sir.
So if the RFP is not out yet, the $12 million, are we going to go out and actually borrow on that from MICLA now? Is that the plan, or it's just to reapprove it and keep it in MICLA?
No, it's basically we'll be using the CP, so whenever the RFP goes out, comes back, the response, there's actually a package that's submitted for approval, then we'll use CP to fund it. This is really just the authority, giving them the authority that once all those steps happen, then they can use the money.
Got it. So we don't anticipate it this year?
No.
This fiscal year?
No.
I think that's all I had on fire department.
Okay. Anything else on fire? Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I wonder if you could remind us
how we wound up with such a significant deficit in the constant staffing overtime. How do we miss that number by such a big number?
The department was under budgeted by $7 million. And then to compound that, the department was anticipating that we would be able to convert the dispatch center from platoon duty to the 40-hour work week. That did not materialize, and that resulted in an additional deficit of $3.2 million because that was the amount that was not appropriated to the department in anticipation of the conversion.
So the second part I understand, the first part I don't totally get. How is it underfunded in budget to begin with?
The department has a specific formula in calculating what the constant staffing overtime needs are going to be for the subsequent fiscal year. And the department submitted the request as part of its budget request to the CAO and the mayor, and ultimately what was adopted by the budget was $7 million short.
So that sounds kind of questionable in the budget process. Presumably, we either understand that we need constant staffing and fund it so that it can happen, or we have a budget direction not to completely do constant staffing because we didn't give you enough money. I'm not sure how we actually had a deficit in the budget to begin with an understanding that we would still expect constant staffing. How did that happen?
I think maybe the question is better answered by the CAO.
That could be.
I think there was a request for additional money. I think as looking at their budget, I think we felt there wasn't quite a need for the amount. They had an opportunity to come to committee and back in May to present their case, and ultimately committee didn't buy off on the request, and here we are today.
So how do we make sure we don't replicate this situation with this coming year budget? Because it seems like there's two choices. We either do a little less than constant staffing, or we budget an adequate amount that allows for us, but it seems like we did neither one, and that doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Here again, going forward, I think we're going to have an opportunity to look at their attrition, look at the hiring classes, look at the fixed post positions. They'll run their models and figure out what they feel they need for next year. A big part of what goes into this model is when people get pulled out of the field to do other assignments, that has an effect on constant staffing. And then actually, to be honest, I mean, that's one of the areas where there's a constant dialogue as far as, well, we need to take this particular person out of the field, out of a fixed post position, because we got this special assignment, which then creates for a constant staffing shortfall. So
right. It doesn't seem like anything happened that was that unusual. So it's not like it was because we had massive numbers of gigantic fires or anything. It just seems like something that we want to make sure when we look at the following year that we take this more into account and actually try to get the number right.
I think you're right, and I think that, as I understand it, the department actually has experienced a little bit greater attrition this year than perhaps they initially expected, and that certainly will have a big impact on the count. So we will look at and work with them on their attrition numbers and what the expectation is when, like I said, the drill tower gets up and running, I think in January or February, when new recruits get in and actually get into the field. So we'll take into account all of those different factors, and we'll present it when we come back to the committee in May again.
Okay, because it seems like their original request was actually pretty on target. So obviously we want to, if we're continuing with the constant staffing strategy, I think we want to actually fund that adequately. My other question is, I understand there's still uncertainty regarding fire emergency medical reimbursements from the state. Is that still the case? And if so, why and where do we think that ultimately winds up?
I don't think that the department shares the level of uncertainty that the Inspector General in the CAO's office has. I think that that's the language that he has included in his report, but the mayor actually had a meeting with the Federal Secretary of Health and Human Services last week. So she clearly understands the urgency of this matter and in fact has assigned to the Deputy Director for the Western Region to provide oversight over the issue. And based on that personal involvement, we're even more comfortable than we were the last time we reported that the city will indeed be reimbursed by the end of this fiscal year.
Very good. That's good news, and those are my only questions.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendahl.
Yeah, constant staffing. Would somebody define what that means? Why that's better than not constant staffing? Just from an economic standpoint, help me understand the constant staffing.
Well, by implementing constant staffing, you're covering your facilities 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're not adding additional resources, pension and healthcare costs for additional firefighters. You're dealing with the current base of firefighters and paying them overtime to deal with the shortfall that occurs when you have people on CTO and not there during the regular shift. So by the alternative not to have additional constant staffing would be increasing our workforce to have greater numbers of sworn available to cover all the various shifts where they occur throughout the city. So in the sense of having constant staffing to just pay for that differential, it saves from adding additional resources to the department.
And it's good to get that on the record. Paying the bill of an ambulance. It's been a big issue for years now. So who's going to take responsibility for paying, and how do we get that revenue stream back?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question, sir.
Somebody goes to the hospital, and they get a bill for that ambulance that the fire department put out. $1,200 or $1,300 for whatever it is. In this day and age, the way we're figuring things out, who is going to pick up that tab, and how do we get that money?
That's a very good question, something we struggle with all the time. I think we're looking, though, forward to with the new Health Care Reform Act coming into place in 2014. It'll cover more people that we currently do not have uncovered. They're self-paid, we call them. In many cases, they're just they're a variety of people, but they're not able to provide payment. We're working closely with our vendor on this whole issue of what would the impact of this legislation have by covering more people? What would the impact on revenue be? What's the size? So those are the questions we're grappling right now and dealing with, and we're hoping to have a better handle within the next few months once we have better information from our vendors, how it's trending, and what the targeted population of the self-paid, which includes unemployed, it includes people who are employed that don't have health insurance, and it includes just that, scope of individuals that we have unsuccessfully been able to collect because of those reasons. So we do think in the future with the implementation of that act, we should be receiving more revenue. I just don't want to overstate the case right now.
No, I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to either, but let's get even a little more personal. I have an old man at the house named Swami X Swami. Venice Beach comic. So he pulls out his PICC line from his heart. I get an ambulance and I get him back to St. John's, my hospital. We get a bill for $1,250. Now, he doesn't have any money. He's living off of me. All of his social services have come through me. I took him in 17, 18 years ago. I felt a little guilty the other day, and I paid for one bill of his, which was for the work done on his feet. $700. Now I have the other $1,200. Should I pay it because I'm a good guy, or what happens to this guy's $1,250?
Well, we can probably work with your office, sir, to see what this gentleman might qualify for.
Well, we did. My office did. And the reality is I'm stuck with the bill. I'm just trying to make the point that if I have to pay it, I'll pay it. But the point is, the big problem is getting people to pay those bills for those ambulances. And we just don't have a handle on how many we're talking about. But more importantly, we don't know how the new law is going to allow us, and we're hopeful it will help, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
I've occasionally run across folks, even in my district, which is in some parts among the more affluent, that intentionally don't call an ambulance when they should because of the cost. what are we doing in terms of how we treat folks that are indigent and don't have any other way to pay, but we're billing them for the service?
The indigent normally will not receive a bill because there's no adequate address for them. It's part of what we would call the self-pay. So they sort of fall in there. The service would be provided. We have to provide those services. But that's one of the challenges we have. There is no one place to bill or collect. For those that do have a resident, we do work, and our vendor works to see if they are qualify for Medi-Cal and Medicare. We do our best to ensure that if they're not, to see how we can enroll them in and get payment through that. And they're, to a certain degree, successful on that. But it does require the cooperation of the transportee. In many cases, they do not want to provide. In other cases, they do. So it's just a varying degree of success we have on that.
So we try to get them into other services that they appropriately qualify for.
Right. Our vendor's pretty good about tracking to see who qualifies and processing paperwork on their behalf.
And what do we do to go after people that aren't indigent and really should be paying it on their own?
Our vendor works the accounts for approximately 9 months per ordinance. After that, we turn it over to a collector or one of our agencies, NCO. They work on it for a year, and they have various methods of going after that, and we have seen some success. More recently, with the newer accounts, it's easier to go after the newer accounts than the older accounts, and that's what we're dealing with primarily right now. So we've had various degrees of success on going after them using our vendor. And those that are not, after several attempts by our vendor, have not been successful, then they'll report it back to us, and we'll go to the Board of Review to ask for those accounts to be written off the books, sir.
So we don't send them to a secondary collector?
At this point, not. They're looking at that, but any secondary collector has to be fully HIPAA compliant, and that's the challenges. We're working with the Office of Financing on those issues, and it's one of the things we're looking at right now, sir.
Yeah, I would certainly encourage that, because I'm sure there are agencies that are HIPAA compliant and follow all the regulations and are willing to take some of the tougher older accounts. And rather than just write them off, obviously that's an opportunity to do some more collections.
Understood.
Thanks.
I'm guessing the Inspector General will be touching upon that during his report, and he's nodding yes. So that'll be coming hopefully within a week or so. Mr. Englander.
Yes, just a couple more questions, and thank you, Mr. Rosendahl, Mr. Koretz, for bringing up those items as well. Actually, I've got an opposite story, Mr. Rosendahl, where I was transported personally a couple years ago by LA Fire from a terrible car accident, and couldn't get a bill out of the fire department at all. Never got one for the transport, and I must have called a dozen times saying, "You transported me, I want to pay my bill." And they said, "No, we have no record of transporting you. Are you sure you were transported?" Yeah, I was pretty sure I was transported.
Wow.
But
It was a worse accident than you thought.
Yeah. Anyway, we tracked it down. It took about a year to track it down and get it paid. But anyway, that was all kinds of issues that we've had to deal with. But in any event, on constant staffing, the point you'd made about that issue, that's an issue we've dealt with for many years. And in fact, it's been this committee that's criticized the department and not, and my predecessor brought it up many times, that those numbers are never brought forward, that it's a formula that you can easily figure out is what's going to be our baseline of coverage citywide for constant staffing. Here's how many shifts you've got. Here's what their ranks are and their pay. And it's always been completely underfunded. And every FSR for many years, there's had to be a transfer to fire just because that number's always been underfunded. Not underfunded by the council and the mayor, per se, but by the department and their projections. And that's always been an issue. I'm confident now that we've got June there, though, we won't face that issue next year. But that's always been an issue. And so we'll continue to see that until they fix that equation. My concern also is on the department was the one that came back and suggested the dispatch center staffing. And I know we've had the conversations often on that $266,000 monthly shortfall in the account because that hasn't been done, and have told its department has come back and told us that it in fact is a meet and confer issue. What's going on with that, and where are we at?
There was a meet and confer session last week, and there's going to be another one scheduled this week. So With the CAO's involvement in negotiations, there has been an attempt to establish a regular negotiation schedule, and that seems to be working. And I understand that the last session was fairly positive, so not sure, what that means in terms of the ability to complete negotiations before the end of the fiscal year, but it seems to be going in the right direction.
Well, if it's not done by the fiscal year, and I would suggest that we don't put it in next year's budget, and then I'd also look at any ideas and savings, whether they're shift or deployment resources or other types of projected efficiencies that could be going into next year's budget, that we look at any issues that, if they're meet and confer issues or other things we've got to apply for, grant funding, or it's not a bird in hand, if you will, that we don't program that into the fire department's budget and then have to go through this every FSR and realize we're not there. And so I will pay close attention to it for the next budget cycle. But with that on the AB 678 funds, could you just give us a quick update on if we really do anticipate that coming in this fiscal year?
Well, I think based on the federal government's understanding and through the meeting that the mayor had with Kathleen Sebelius, I think it's pretty clear. In addition, the International Association of Firefighters also had meetings with Senator Boxer and Feinstein. So at the federal level, they certainly are aware of how critical the approval by CMS is. So for that reason, with the top people being involved, it's for that reason we're very, very optimistic that the reimbursement is going to be approved and processed, and we will be receiving the reimbursement this fiscal year.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have GSD who came back, so if
Came
we
back
could just
and answer your fuel question.
Yeah, so if we could just have a real quick discussion about the petroleum pricing assumptions. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Renee B. Augustine, General Services.
So my question on this was not to suggest in any way that any human being should be held accountable for trying to predict the actual cost of gasoline, but rather that as we determine what our budgetary assumption is for the year, what are the factors that we base that budgetary assumption on a per gallon basis for the cost of gasoline? And how does that correlate to what's done in the federal budget, what's done in the California state budget, what's done in the private sector or other kinds of budgets? What do you look to in trying to peg a blended annual per gallon price of unleaded and diesel fuel?
Sure. For GSD, for the city, what we normally do is we look at it on a historical basis, what we've consumed in the past and what fuel prices done in the past. So for this fiscal year, we budgeted $48 million, $39 million in the budget with $9 million in the UB. So in the way we see it, it's about $48 million. What's happening now is that what you're normally seeing is the normal trend of fuel prices going back up in the springtime. You have refineries that have been down because of scheduled maintenance, and so you have a shortage of gasoline, so you start typically seeing that the fuel prices do start to go up. We, on a price per gallon basis, we're paying, as of this week, as of last week, we were paying a little less than $3.30 for unleaded and $3.70 for diesel. So what you normally see in the commercial, we're paying about 20 cents cheaper than what you would normally see at the pumps. So,
okay.
But in terms of, we did canvass in anticipation of this question last year, we did provide some answers in terms of what we do and what we did canvass the state, we did canvass the county, we did canvass numerous municipalities, and they typically do the same thing that we do. They look at the history and their usage and come up with some figures. There's really no right or wrong way of doing it, but it's typically the same way we're doing it right now. In fact, some of them have commented back as we follow the same way the city does it. So, but in terms of the privates, they may do some things differently. They may hedge. Southwest is a big company that does some hedging. So that's the variations in how we.
I guess this is a really microscopic point in the scheme of things, I guess, but all I want to make sure of is that our budgetary assumption for the price that we assume over the next year for a gallon of unleaded fuel and a gallon of diesel fuel is comparable to the budgetary assumption that is made by other governmental entities, that we're not understating or underestimating the per gallon price. I get that it's wildly variable, and that there's a process and historical trends and so forth. But the outcome of that, when we get to the point where you plug into the budget an assumption, a given average price, I just want to make sure that that average price is closely similar to what's done by other governments. Can you say that is the case?
I would only assume that they would do that, and I'm premising that because they're using historical data like we are in terms of their usage, our usage, and what fuel prices have been doing in the past and what we anticipate the fuel prices to be. We usually put a 5% contingency on fuel prices and consumption going up just to make sure that we are within budget. So.
Okay.
If I could?
Yeah, Mr.
Jump in? Good afternoon. How many vehicles are we talking about do we get gasoline for, and how many gallons as well?
We roughly use right now about 15.9 million gallons of fuel.
And is that every vehicle connected with the city or just?
Just the proprietary departments, fire, police, and all the it does not include water and power, does not include harbor or the airports. And we're talking about over 17,000 pieces of equipment.
Yeah, what'd you say about the airport and proprietary departments? What about those three, DWP, airport, and harbor?
They budget for their own fuel.
But if we budgeted with them, could we get a better price?
That's something that we've looked at in the past. We've tried to partner with the county, and we've also looked into solicitations nationwide, and it turns out it's not favorable for us to, it just doesn't come out that it's favorable for us.
Has we done an analysis of the proprietary departments in our city general department to make that conclusion?
We have, and they, at this time, at least the proprietary departments have not partnered with the city.
I understand, but by partnering with the city, could we get a better deal by getting more gasoline gallons and all that?
We have looked at,
Name for the
Angela
record.
Sherrick with the Department of General Services. We have looked at the proprietary departments, and generally, they piggyback on our contracts. We did work with the county at one point, and we actually went out to bid with them, but we found that our pricing was actually better because the county had more sites than we did, and the delivery would have to go farther.
Right.
So our pricing was actually better than the county's. With respects to the other question that was asked about canvassing other municipalities in the state,
Yeah.
what we can do is take a look at what they've done and bring back a report and try to look at those specific numbers if that's what you'd like to see.
I would appreciate it, just to give us a level of comfort that whatever our process is, it's coming to the more or less the same conclusion that others are coming to. Recognizing that there's that there's a lot of black magic involved in trying to pull a number out of the air when it comes to the global price of fuel. But, as we're all going through that process, we ought to be coming to more or less the same conclusion. If it's a significant difference, in other words, that would suggest to me a problem in our process that's leading to inaccurate budgeting. And so that's all I'm after. So yes, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
And when you said, sir, a minute ago that it was $3 and what are we paying the price for a gallon of gas?
Oh,
You said 3 something.
As of last week, we're paying $3.37 for unleaded and $3.70 for diesel.
And what is it right now at the pumps?
typically, you'll see the pumps right now at $4, and I've seen as high as $4.20, at least.
So because the way you've done it, we're lower than that, and as they go to raise it more, which we get a suspicion right now, it looks like they're going to do, we're still based on our average of before. So from a conservative standpoint, the city of LA seems to be ahead of that.
That's correct.
So hats off. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming back down. Sorry about that. All right, that brings us to
Is neighborhood empowerment.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, let's go to neighborhood empowerment next, and
I'll let you know in a second. Sorry.
actually, Mr. Englander, you had a question on
Yeah,
that.
just a quick question. Just two quick questions, actually. It said that there was a deficit due to expenditures and encumbrances exceeding estimates. Trying to figure out how that occurred and what those were. And then there's also a reappropriation of $3,500 to one particular neighborhood council on the Kitty Bungalow Charm School for Wayward Cats. If you can walk us through those two.
Hi, good afternoon, council members. Gracie Liu, General Manager for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. The $700,000 to $1 million shortfall that we've identified, and when I say we, it's the department controller and the CAO's office. We identified this in approximately November of last year, and it appears as though basically over the past years, with the rollover policies and the encumbrances that neighborhood councils were able to carry forward, what has happened is that now in this year, current fiscal year, where they can't do that anymore, it looks like we identified this shortfall, this potential shortfall, that was a result of appropriated balances being carried forward without the cash to substantiate them or to back them up. So as of this past FSR, it looks like we actually may come out balanced, which would be great. But we probably won't know this until at least the third FSR, and at that point we'll have a better update about what's going on. And in regards to did you have other further questions?
Just that other one, that
Okay.
reappropriation
Right.
out of, what is that?
The
What happened
Kitty
there?
Bungalow. So last fiscal year, several neighborhood councils provided neighborhood purpose grants for Kitty Bungalow, which is a nonprofit organization that helps adopt cats. It was delayed last fiscal year because of the trap, neuter, release ban in the city at the time, and these amounts were supposed to be encumbered, and they were not encumbered, and so as a result, we are trying to actually now transfer those funds from previous fiscal year to the current fiscal year so that these MPGs can now be honored now that the trap, neuter, release ban has been lifted.
Okay, so it's not a question of them overspending? It wasn't necessarily any
No, not at
particular
all.
neighborhood council overspending what they originally encumbered?
Right.
It was the fact
Actually, there have been no neighborhood councils that have encumbered monies that they were not allowed in the first place,
Got
so
it.
they didn't overspend.
Okay, thank you.
And I will make the editorial comment that the encumbrance problem of neighborhood councils over the last decade has been a nightmare, and Dunn deserves a great deal of credit in sort of bringing that long nightmare to a more positive place now that we've changed a lot of the policies on rollovers and encumbrances, and I think we're starting to get a handle on something that was not well administered and not well documented, I think, until recently. And so hats off to the department for the progress that we've been making in that regard.
Thank you very much.
Anything else for neighborhood empowerment? Okay, Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And next, we have the zoo, and then we'll go to the GCP, which is, I think there's a question on emergency homeless
very
shelters.
good. Very
Okay,
good.
that's
Thank
just
you.
a question.
All right. Mr. Englander.
Yes, on the zoo, the question is, the implementation of the dollar increase we approved for this fiscal year was delayed severely, which, and I'm trying to figure out what happened, what will cause the delay.
Terry Sauer, CAO staff. Mr. Englander, it was an instruction as part of Exhibit H, but the actual adoption of the ordinance by council was after July 1, and then there's the 30-day period, publication period. So with the timing of that, the city attorney did not act until council had actually approved the fee increase as part of the adopted budget, and so there's some lag time. What that meant is basically it wasn't until later in the year that the ordinance was in place and the zoo could, in fact, collect the money.
Do you know when the ordinance was actually in place then?
No, I do not, council member. We can get that information for your staff, but I don't know when specifically it was adopted. I believe it was either late August or the beginning of September, which would have put it in place around October 1st.
If you could double check and just let me know when this comes to council. I'll
By
keep
all
that
means.
flag. That would be great, just on when it was implemented.
Thank you.
Thank you
Anything
very
else on
much.
the zoo, members? Okay. Thank you very much. All
Okay, then there was a question on, I think, emergency homeless shelters.
Yeah, it says there's a $21,000 loss in the shelter program and the grant reductions, and so I wanted to ensure that this is being made up, or at a minimum, we're not losing any beds or evenings with the loss, that we're operating our shelters as we planned. So I want to see if there's
Who
any
can speak to that?
programmatic or impacts to the shelters with that loss. Make sure that there's not. And if we don't have the answer now, that's fine. That's okay. I could keep the question out there. We can just report back when this comes to council as well.
We'll get in touch with housing.
Okay.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I could also comment on what Mr. Englander said. I agree with him on that, but I also want to go on record that in the 11th District, we don't have a shelter after March 1st. There are about 500 homeless people in shelters in other parts of the city, and we need one in Venice. I met with the head of LASA today, Mike Arnold, to talk about that, and I'm going to look for my colleagues' support in having one in Venice year-round that can meet the needs of the homeless people in Venice. But thanks for raising it the way you did.
All right. Thank you. All right, members, then if there is nothing further on the FSR, entertain a motion to approve the report.
Make a motion to approve the report as presented.
One other question.
Oh, okay, Mr. Kretz has one more question.
And I guess this is probably for the CAO. What are our lobbyists doing in Sacramento to make sure that the governor's office doesn't suspend reimbursement for 2012, 2013? Or is that likely to happen? Are we concerned?
In what area, as far as the AB 678 or any state mandates?
The first one.
We had this discussion earlier. I think really the ball is in sort of the federal hands right now. His fire department had reported that basically the mayor had reached out on a federal level, and I think they've been in touch with Senator Boxer's office as well to sort of push the issue on the federal level. We're waiting for their approval and okay, and then we'll flow down. At the same time, I know there's been some conversations at the state level that once there is the federal approval, then yes, we do get our money, and so we're not shortchanged.
So we're pretty sure they're not going to hold that money up.
At this point, I think we're pretty confident that the state, given sort of where they are budgetarily, they seem to be in a much better spot now than they were over a year ago. And so we're confident once the feds release the money, then we'll be okay.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So were you going to speak to that question, or?
No, but
Okay,
just
so
another
Ms.
addition.
Okay.
And
go ahead.
Karen Calfine with the CLA's office, and just wanted to bring to your attention that we had some amendments for that we wanted to add to this for the council. These are some adjustments within budgeted funds to meet current spending patterns.
Okay, and that's what's already been distributed before us?
Yes.
Okay, so with those amendments, Mr. Englander has moved approval of the report, and without objection.
And it also includes a fire reversion
Yes.
instruction as well.
Okay.
And we'll make sure the clerk has
I
all the...
apologize, colleagues. There is one card on that, so before we vote on the matter, I'd like to ask Mr. McQuiston to come forward, please. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Jim McQuiston. I'm sorry to be late and put the card in late, but the reason was it took me a half hour going through our new website, trying to get something off the website. And I've heard from the underground a lot of delay trying to operate the new website, and people are upset in city government about it. And I'm thinking, as a cost analyst, we're losing a lot of employee time just trying to manipulate on the new website. Some things seem to have disappeared. And I think this is something that Budget and Finance might want to talk to ITA about, because the old website, of course, people knew how to operate. The new website is completely different, completely. And
Mr.
I don't know if
you could
people...
speak to the FSR, because we're running short on
and as far as the FSR is concerned, it is a problem, because we're going to have a lot more employee time lost on this matter, and I think somebody has to take a look at that quickly from Budget and Finance.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So without objection, members, it will be the action of the committee to approve the FSR. That brings us, before we go to item number 2, I just, Mr. Rosendahl and Mr. Kretz, I had proposed that item 3 be considered as a candidate for consent. There was a technical revision that was made to that, which Mr. Englander and I both approved of, which if you could just restate, Mr. Serrano, so that we can vote.
Sure. The added instruction would be that the CEO make available to the mayor and council encumbrance data prior to the automatic reversion process.
Fine. So without objection, it will be the action of the committee then to approve item number 3. All right. So that brings us then to item number 2, City at a Crossroads. Mr. Santana, welcome.
Thank you very much, Miguel Santana, CAO. It's interesting seeing the discussion around the mid-year FSR, because this is probably the first mid-year FSR since I got here that we weren't in crisis with the capital C. So it certainly speaks to the hard work of your committee, of the council as a whole, and the leadership of the mayor to get us at a point where we could say that the budget is balanced for this fiscal year. And so this really speaks to sort of the tenor of this report. We have a PowerPoint presentation. I won't go through all of the charts because there's quite a few, but I do want to highlight 3 in particular. The first one is page 2. Now, page 2 basically summarizes exactly what the work has been over the last 4 years, and really captures in a summary the progress that's been made. And all of you have stated that, back in 2009-10, we projected the deficit on July 1st of 2013, when the new mayor and new council comes into place, the city would have been facing a $1 billion deficit. Today, that projection is at $216 million, a significant reduction of 80%. And so we went back and really tried to identify, so how did exactly was that done? And this report goes into some very specific detail of how your council has been able to make this progress. And so the biggest section here, which I think many people in the public would be surprised to hear, is actually related to pension savings. Pension reform was one of the first things that your council decided to work on. Very early, it adopted and presented to the public a new pension tier for sworn officers, since we were still hiring police officers. You also introduced, as part of that package, a 20% reduction in their starting pay of all new officers, helping reduce that overall cost in the long term. Reducing the size of the workforce obviously has a ripple effect on our pension savings. And then, of course, earlier last year, you adopted a new pension tier for civilian employees that becomes effective July 1st. And central to all that is, of course, the work that's been done around retiree health care. Mr. Rosendahl, you talked about the fact that the Pew Center has recognized that the city is to be applauded for having a sustainable program around retiree health care. Few other cities can say the same. And part of that is the fact that we pre-fund health care, don't just pay as you go, but also because our employees, most are paying for that benefit. Most civilians are currently paying 4%, and our sworn most are paying 2%. And so those pieces, plus all of the other reforms, have resulted in about $263 million with savings to help reduce that deficit, as well as changes done at both the Lacers and Fire and Police pension funds. In addition to that, the next biggest piece are department cuts across the board. And, you know, every year for the last 4 years during the budget, the city engages in a very difficult process of figuring out who to cut without having an impact on public safety. And to illustrate how painful that's been, if you go to page 6 of this chart, it shows you how dramatic these cuts have been on 3 departments. First, in the LA Zoo, in 2006-07, they received an additional subsidy of $10.6 million beyond the taking care of their related costs. This year, that subsidy is down to $1.3 million. And if we do not receive additional revenue through the proposed increase in the sales tax, that's likely to reduce even further. In animal services, their department has been reduced by over 20% since 2009-10. And you could talk to the general manager, you could talk to the staff there, how difficult it's been to maintain that program, and they've been able to be successful in part of partnerships that they've established, like the one they have with Best Friends out in the San Fernando Valley, that allows a shelter to be in operation on somebody else's nickel. Our internal departments that provide support to public safety and to the rest of the city have experienced dramatic cuts in staffing. GSD had 1,916 employees in 2008-09. They're now down to 1,262. ITA experienced dramatic cuts with 807 employees in 08 and 09, and now down to 479. So for those who question that there's been resolve and to balance the budget over the last 4 years, they simply need to look on the actual impacts that has had across the board throughout the city. No department, including my own, has been exempt from any cuts, as well as your offices and the mayor's office have all experienced significant reductions in your capacity to provide services, and in some cases under an environment of greater demand. Revenue growth has obviously been part of the overall solution, but not the biggest portion. $177 million has come through new revenues, has come as a result of the dissolution of the CRA. There was additional revenue that's provided, and also in light of the fact that we've done better in our collections, as the Inspector General will report to you later, and the fact that the economy is improving. We are seeing some optimistic signs for next year's budget, both in terms of being able to create a budget stabilization fund that we hope to reach $80 million for next year to help address next year's shortfall. And revenue growth, we expect to continue to move upwards. Currently, it's about 2.5%. We're hoping it continues to grow at that pace, if not higher, and that those projections will come out with the mayor's budget. So the overall picture is in fact improving. And it's a combination of solutions, a combination of the economy improving that's gotten us to a point of reducing the structural deficit as much as we have. The challenge is that it's not moving fast enough. And so we all know how difficult it is. And if you go to page 5, it gives you an illustration of how challenging the future looks like. You know, the city has worked as hard as it can to protect public safety. And so you've heard me say a number of times that over 70% of the unrestricted dollars, in fact, goes to public safety. It reflects your priorities, it reflects the priorities of the public. But when you include beyond public safety, library, rec and parks, public works, transportation, building safety, planning, and convention center, debt service, we're talking about 47% of your overall $7.2 billion budget. And 48% is already restricted, meaning that it has a specific purpose. You can't use the sewer revenues or gas tax grants or fees to pay for police officers. Those have to go to a specific purpose. So what's remaining beyond that? We're talking about 5% of the overall unrestricted revenue that remains. So when we're trying to solve for a $216 million budget deficit, or it's a $200 million or $100 million or $70 million, you're working from the context of about $359 million, which pays for animal services, the city attorney, controller, CAO, cultural affairs, emergency management, finance, your office, the mayor's office, city clerk, disability, zoo, and a handful of others. And so it is not surprising that this process is difficult, because when most of these departments have already experienced between a 20 to 30% reduction, the question is, what else is there to cut? And that's a budget process that we're currently going through with the mayor's office, and that you will be going through after April 20th, is understanding that very complex and difficult challenge. So currently we are trying to figure out, how do we actually close that deficit? And the reason why the Budget Stabilization Fund was so important is because should the sales tax proposal not pass, we want to begin the year with a cushion that reduces that deficit. So if you go to the last page, page 14, it gives you a projection of what life could potentially look like if in fact the sales tax passes. So we know that the deficit for next year is 216, and then it rises to over 300 million, and it hovers around that area over the next few years. And so those are you're used to seeing the orange and the dark blue line. What we superimpose is what that looks like should the revenue come in from the sales tax proposal. It would increase overall revenue growth to 3.6% versus 2.5%. It doesn't eliminate 100% our structural deficit, but it obviously gets us a long way there. Beyond that, for next year, we are expecting improvement in what our pension costs will be. We'll still pay more than we're paying this year, but the rate in which we're paying it will be less, largely in part to many of the reforms that you have adopted and the progress that's been made, also because of changes in our pension systems. So we expect that to be about $43 million less. That's what even projected in this chart alone. And when you include the Budget Stabilization Fund that we've said, that keep in mind is one-time revenue, it's not an ongoing source of revenue, then we could see the light of the tunnel for next year should the sales tax in fact pass. And then for the subsequent years, it continues to be important that your council remain disciplined across the board in terms of the growth of city government, in terms of ensuring that we're aggressively pursuing revenues that we're entitled to receive, like collections, as well as when we negotiate with our labor partners. Now, this work is something that you as a council should be very proud of, and certainly hasn't been done in isolation. The men and women who work for the City of Los Angeles have felt the sacrifice as a result to bring about these kinds of results, and certainly under the leadership of the mayor, we've been able to get there. And so the good news is that we've come a long way, and there's much to be proud of. The challenge is that we're not quite done yet, and the work that lies ahead will be contingent on ultimately what the people of Los Angeles decide on March 5th for the sales tax. Life without the sales tax means that we continue to be in a place where we're living year to year, month to month, trying to figure out what to cut without having an impact on public safety. It places everything back on the table, including requiring that the Rec and Parks Department continue to pay more of their indirect cost. It will obviously make maintaining the existing workforce in the police department a greater challenge. The discussion this year alone around the civilian workforce in the police department has demonstrated how difficult that is. And worst of all, being able to invest in our infrastructure, invest in preparing ourselves for liabilities, and ultimately bringing back a level of service that Angelenos expect would become much more difficult. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, Mr. Rosendahl.
Look, Measure A is on the ballot. Measure A gives us a 0.5% sales tax, can give us $220 million, correct?
Correct.
My district, if we didn't have a Measure A, and we allowed the other process to happen, which is transfer tax, tax on property, and tickets, the three big areas that are the irritable. At one point, you thought you could maybe raise, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 with that strategy, historically. I actually think Measure A is absolutely great for my district, which should be paying a lot more because it's the rich and privileged versus the people in the rest of the city in the context of that tax system. Though my folks are very privileged, and they make it very clear who they are and what they do. How do we penetrate my district, which clearly benefits by a 0.5% sales tax versus the other? We obviously signed statements. We've been public about it. You did a statement that the LA Times covered. And I'd just like to get from you a sense of what we should do to convince my constituents it's in their best interest, frankly, to go for that 0.5% sales tax versus what would be the other strategy, which would be very difficult for my folks to appreciate. How do we get that clarity to them?
Well, I'm not going to campaign for this initiative. Obviously, that's not appropriate. But I could say that what is appropriate is to be honest with people about the trade-offs, and that what the report tries to do is provide a factual discussion on the work that's been done already, and to dispel any myths that, in fact, the city has not made the difficult choices, to be honest about the challenges that lie ahead and the trade-offs associated with not having the increased revenue. At the end of the day, the city still has to have a balanced budget. It's in the charter, it's a requirement. And so how that is done, and to the extent that it impacts average Angelenos, will be based on the outcome of that initiative.
Could you, not talking politics, obviously, could you quantify the amount of money that my district folks would pay if we didn't put this in there, just the facts?
I can't do that on the top of my head, but what I can say is the question of the infrastructure that everyone utilizes. You know, one of the most compelling charts here is if you look at a chart in our report that looks at all the revenue sources that have contributed to, it's on page 27 of the larger report, on maintaining our streets. one of the first things that went when the crisis hit was the city's contribution towards maintaining our pavement preservation program. Back in 2006-07, we contributed 30% of the program through the general fund. Now it's about 1%. So basically, we've eliminated any general fund from maintaining our streets and roads because we were in a crisis. Fortunately, those funds were replaced through Proposition 1B, and then in part with Proposition C dollars that are coming in. Here's the unfortunate reality: those dollars are drying up and will be gone next year. So in order to maintain, and no one knows better than Mr. Englander, to maintain our program, which basically keeps our streets at the status quo, doesn't move the ball forward, but just hopes that they don't get worse. We need to find a new revenue source. Otherwise, we're going to have to dramatically cut the street preservation program. That everyone drives the streets in Los Angeles, whether you're rich or poor, whether you live on the west side or the east side. This is an issue, and you could drive. I was in your district this weekend, and it was, I don't know if it was a good thing or bad thing, but the streets were the same quality as they are in my community in Westlake. And so there's certainly no preferential treatment that's going on in terms of the street program in the city of Los Angeles. We all are suffering the potholes and the ineffective streets that we have.
Mr. Kretz? Mr. Englander?
Just first, a couple of things. One, I want to take us back in time, if I can, for a moment. And while it's not time for applause quite yet, and there, even again with some of the potential revenue streams that you discussed, doesn't get us out of the woods. I think it's mindful that the policies that were presented and passed by the council came out of this very committee. In fact, the previous chair of this committee, Bernard Parks, along with my predecessor, Greg Smith, deserve a lot of credit, which isn't mentioned here, but in creating the budget stabilization fund, and prior to the governor cutting the CRA, coming up with the ideas with you on EDD, as well as the 1% infrastructure, all those things that came out of this committee with our CLA's office as well, that deserves a lot of credit, quite frankly, for coming up with a lot of these very difficult decisions that ultimately the council then passed and mayor approved. So I just want to make sure that that's absolutely part of the record, and anytime we discuss these things, and sort of not how we got into this mess in the first place, because every city across the country is dealing with this, but how we've gotten out of this responsibly and structurally, and there's still a long way to go. And then looking at that, the look ahead of the 5 priorities, I think we should have a broader discussion at some point on exactly what those mean. Because a look ahead for me is a little different than sustainability. In ensuring public safety, I would quite frankly be a little more proactive in saying improving public safety. Because there's a lot of issues in dealing, obviously the police department has been doing a phenomenal job, and crime's at an all-time low, but with AB 109 and some of the other issues that we look at, well, there's always room for improvement, and what can we do instead of sustaining it, but that's going to be some challenges we've got to constantly look at, and being proactive. Same thing with supporting the basic city infrastructure. Our city infrastructure is crumbling. If we support it, we're in trouble. We've got to invest in it, and we've got to make some dramatic changes, quite frankly, as you discussed, in investing and coming up with new revenue streams. We're looking at a $3 billion backlog in just our streets on our DNF failed streets. That's doubled every 10 years, that number doubles. 20 years ago, it was $700 million. 10 years ago, it was $1.5 billion. Today, it's $3 billion. If we continue on that, and particularly since Prop 1B funds are dwindling, we've seen in this FSR, the gas tax money is also shrinking and depleting, then that's less money that's going to go to our streets. That number will double. It's inevitable that it'll be $6 billion by the time we blink an eye. So I think we've got to improve the quality of life is a lot of the issues we've got to discuss in moving forward and stabilizing the city workforce, certainly. But I'd like to see, in addition to this, a sixth bullet is creating the city of the future. And we can't just talk about the crossroads, because if we're talking about crossroads, then those are two different roads. One, which is towards a path of insolvency and failure, which is not an option, or two, which is maintaining and sustaining the programs we have and improving the quality of life and improving public safety, but creating that city of the future, whether it's investment in technology and smart growth opportunities, a lot of the initiatives that are coming around, all the community support for smart development, smart growth around major transportation hubs. I mean, all those things that we're all working on in all the other committees as well, as the community is working on these, consolidating and streamlining our processes and the bureaucratic red tape here, which is another major initiative to create additional efficiencies and savings. So I think having the discussion on any time we talk about sort of crossroads, and you did a great job, and I got to tell you that having been the passenger, if you will, on this flight, as a chief of staff, when we started working on this together, and now as a council member, I don't know that there's anybody that could have really steered this wreckage and landed us where we're at without your guidance and support and leadership. And so, first and foremost, the credit goes to you, and I appreciate it. And I think that has to be stated, because you've really done a phenomenal job and not always getting the support, quite frankly, from a lot of the initiatives that you've pushed forward on. So I think the idea is if you ask for 10 cents and you get 8 of it, or 7 of it, or 6 of it, it's been a success. And that's what occurred. But along the way, a lot of policies were also created.
Back in California.
And somebody's back in California.
World.
And hopefully that's not Governor Perry. His plane landed.
He's a Republican, remember?
I think moving forward, we've got a major change coming along here with all the new council members and the new mayor and new controller coming in place, that they understand full well what the policies that this committee and this council have pushed forward, and they don't come in trying to soften any of those. And that's something that's very important. I've talked to the council president about that as well, as perhaps getting together with the chair of budget and finance and developing a leadership school and training them as they come in place to learn our policies before they cast a single vote or put in a motion. But in any event, wanted to just share my 2 cents with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, council member. And I certainly, I don't work in isolation. Certainly the credit really goes to the office of the CAO, but really the men and women who work in the city of Los Angeles, who have had to suffer through uncertainty over the last 4 years, coming home each night, not being able to tell their spouses and families what their salaries are going to be, and the uncertainty around that. It certainly has been a challenge, and what's before you and the voters of Los Angeles is an opportunity to provide some level of stability.
Thank you very much, Mr. Englander, and thank you, Mr. Santana. I just wanted to highlight a couple of quick points. I mean, I think first the pie chart on page 2 is really important for everyone to understand. First of all, the headline of this, that the projected deficit for next year of over $1 billion has been reduced by 80%. That is a remarkable success during the most turbulent and difficult of financial times that this country has faced since the Great Depression. That the mayor and the council and your office and the CLA, but especially the working people of the city of, our employees in the city of Los Angeles and our constituents have sacrificed so much to make that happen. And if you look at that pie chart, it really does show that. I mean, we have over, I'm back of the envelope here, about $400 million in reductions in benefits, salary, and pension benefits by city employees that have contributed to that over $1 billion. $250 million in departmental cuts, which means reduced services to our constituents. Every one of those cuts is a service that isn't being performed. anymore that our constituents expect us to perform. So they're making a sacrifice too. And then, of course, the other important thing about that chart is that glaring yellow slice of the 216 million that we still have to go to be able to bridge the gap. And that brings me to the, less positive part of this report, which is that we have a long way to go. $200 million is a huge deficit still to fill, especially given the fact that we've done so much already. And there's significant areas of question, if not deep concern, in the offing. And you've highlighted many of those in the report, and I think one of them, which Mr. Rosendahl alluded to earlier, was the federal funding that we get and the impact of the sequestration debates that are going on right now in Washington. This could have a potentially devastating effect on our economic recovery as well as on the health of our budget if Congress makes unwise choices about its support of local government. We're seeing good news on the economy, but it's slow growth. It's seems to be sustained growth, but it's slow. And there's no guarantee that it continues. I think the signs are looking optimistic, but it's fragile. The national recovery is fragile, and certainly our local recovery is fragile as well if we don't do more to continue to entice business development here in Los Angeles, to create new jobs in Los Angeles and new revenues. The local economic recovery that produces so much of our revenues is very much in danger. And that's going to take some money. Investment in the Economic Development Department and policies like some of the ones that Mr. Englander alluded to that are important to develop our economy. Those are dependent upon budgeting. And if we don't have the funds to be able to budget towards that economic recovery in itself is going to be set back. The police department continues to have challenges with its overtime and keeping cops on the street while still managing an overtime budget is a real issue that we have to continue to be vigilant about monitoring for the foreseeable future and reducing that unfunded liability, if you will. And of course, we have all the question marks that surround the significant litigation that you remind us of often, and the city attorney reminds us of often as well. And then laying on top of that is the issue that we're grappling with right now in the ad hoc committee on business tax reform, which is how do we make the city a more enticing place for businesses to expand and to relocate without causing further harm to our general fund budget. And I think many of the things that we need to do, as I mentioned, to make this a more attractive place to business are going to require spending and investing in our infrastructure, in reforming the way we govern, as Mr. Englander alluded to. All of those things need to be done. They're going to take some money. And at the time that we're facing almost a $250 million deficit for next year, and we're talking about policies that would reduce those revenues, at least initially, with gross receipts tax reduction, that's a very serious policy choice that we have to weigh carefully. And so we're going to continue to do that in the ad hoc committee as well as here. Then I guess the final point I want to make is, there are people out there, and maybe this goes to Mr. Rosendahl's concern about how we talk to people about this. There are a lot of people out there who are talking about the very cuts and reductions that you mentioned in this report as being scare tactics and things like that, and they always threaten us with public safety cuts and whatever. And I just have to say that this report and the FSR and everything else that we deal with in this committee on a regular basis shows that public safety is not just threatened, public safety has already been deeply cut. and maybe not in the police department so much, but as Mr. Englander pointed out, there are significant concerns about our response times in the fire department and what that means for public safety. If we have reductions in the Department of Transportation, that has direct impacts on pedestrian safety. We have over 20% reduction in the personnel and animal services, obviously impacting public safety. When we don't fund programming in recreation and parks, we don't have prevention that obviously impacts public safety. The city attorney's office is a public safety agency. Emergency preparedness is, you can go straight down the line of almost everything that you talk about in this report, and for much of it, identify a direct public safety impact that we have already incurred. And to take away, the potential for additional revenues on top of that, and then have to figure out where we're going to find another nearly a $250 million in additional reductions without just hoping that the economy just takes care of it, which I think, is a fool's errand. If anybody thinks that somehow economic recovery is just going to make up for our deficit, well, they're wrong. It isn't. And in order to fill this deficit, I guarantee we will make more cuts, and that will impact public safety, period. And it will impact everything else that is important to the residents of our city and maintaining a decent quality of life and having a functioning city. So I think your report, Mr. Santana, is a very important statement that I hope people will take the time to really absorb and understand. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think my objection for several years to the mayor insisting on maintaining a 10,000 person police force is not that I don't think public safety is important, but it actually hides the cuts that have been made directly to the LAPD as well, because we've dramatically cut their overtime, which I believe is the equivalent of probably 500 officers. We've dramatically cut civilians, so we have sworn officers in the jails. So people don't necessarily see the cuts that we've made to that department, but that department has already been hit. Not quite as hard as others, because public safety is understandably our top priority, but that department has already been hammered as well as a result of the economy. So people think that's an untouched department and everything else has been cut, but they've already been cut pretty far as well. And we have made every possible cut to every possible department, and in some cases gone even beyond what's wise. There are no good cuts left after years of slamming our city budget year after year. So I think the idea that this is a scare tactic is something advanced by folks that don't really understand how dire our budget condition really is.
I was just going to say, in addition, I think, we hear a lot of, well, what about the council offices and everybody else? And it's important to keep in mind that council offices took collectively over that time period as well about a 27% hit. So council offices 30%, which is far more than most of the average departments as well. So we're trying, in our districts didn't shrink any more than they are now. So.
And as we pointed out last time when we dealt with the encumbrances, when item number 3 on today's agenda is approved by the council, that will include a few $1 million more in lost encumbrances to both council and mayor's office as well. So, colleagues, if there's nothing more, Mr. Santana, thank you very much for both the good news and the sobering news contained in this report. And as I say, it's very instructive to have this in one place. I think this is one of the most important reports that I've seen in this committee, and I hope that the public will take it to heart.
One final question with that. Actually, good point, Mr. Chair. Is this PowerPoint on your website and viewable for the public?
We will put it on our website, and I'll present the entire thing to council.
Well, yes, but if we could, like in our weekly newsletters, perhaps put a link up to this, I think it would be very helpful for neighborhood councils and others to see a copy of, yes, your final report, but the PowerPoint, because there's a lot of good graphs and charts that explain it. That'd be great.
Thank you very much. We do have I have two cards so far on item number 2, so if anybody else would like to comment, please fill out a card and bring it forward. I have Jim McQuiston, who will be followed by John Stevenson. Mr. McQuiston.
Jim McQuiston, as you know, I've said many, many times, last HON budget, we had $1 billion left over, $1 billion. Now, we don't have much left over every year, but we do have some. That's what we call our deficit. But I want to say this. We have historically a 4% cost of living increase minimum every year for at least 40 years. We only get an increase in our income of about 2%. That means we're in the water torture death unless we do something. We actually go into a lawsuit, as I've said many, many, many times, and we can really blast that cost of living cap that the state is putting on us, and we don't have any problems with our budget. And that is what we have to do. Otherwise, the water torture is going to get us. The income.
Explain that again. I'm a little lost in your last comment.
Pardon?
Explain the state.
Okay. Let's put it this way. We have a substantial election coming up. One of the things that I want to say, other than this, is this. The city council has to stop managing. Because they manage, we're not following our laws. And that means there's a lot of bureaucratic time wasted trying to cover up or trying to fight. The city attorney has problems and everything else. So we do have some other problems besides the 2%, 4%. But that is our basic problem, and there is a way out. We can do it, but we have to have the guts, just like we had guts to put in a trash fee. Remember that? The city council said that they were all going to get thrown out if we put in a trash fee. But we said no, and we saved $230 million the first year.
Right.
So this is what we have to do. And we have to have resolve to do it, and the city council can lead on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chris.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, or final speaker, is Mr. Stevenson. Good afternoon.
So as you know, my name is John Stevenson. I'm a homeowner in Van Nuys and member of the Lake Balboa neighborhood councils. And obviously you've had some people come from our neighborhood councils come visit with you, I guess, with this last initiative to try to raise some money for fixing the roads. We fought it adamantly. We're not happy about it. I'm a lifelong resident of the city, or San Fernando Valley, and looking at this budget that was prepared, I should say pie charts that were prepared by Daniel Weissman. I'm sure you know who he is. Looks like property taxes are probably the biggest chunk of revenue that you get from us. So, as you know, the San Fernando Valley wanted to secede at one time, and the Adamants are starting to build up again, I'll tell you that. We're not real happy with the way the city council has been managing the funds. I can remember in 1970 as a kid, when I used to see stores and places to shop, they're all mostly mom and pop stores. Why we constantly give tax breaks to these big box stores and these big entities, it just baffles me. They don't need the money. They don't need the tax breaks. If they want to bring their business here to the city of Los Angeles, let them. Because if they don't, trust me, there'll be other people that will supply services. There's always going to be a demand for supply. I think giving away tax breaks, that's our money that you're giving away all the time in city council, and constantly, time after time, when I look at the schedule, voting on things, AEG, I mean, that's a sweetheart deal that they just basically used against us. You look at the roads, you look at the infrastructure. I worked for DWP last year for 8 months. I can tell you personally, from walking into distribution stations, receiving stations, the equipment is from the 30s, okay? Like the gentleman, Mitch Englander, I had a business in Chatsworth for 11 years, okay? Your predecessor was my, council person. Very good, by the way. And I want to tell you that this city is crumbling big time. The roads, the infrastructure, we constantly approve more and more residences, these multi-unit dwellings, and the infrastructure is not there. All right. One last thing. Before we start doing more busways, I don't understand why the city council hasn't entertained a monorail. It's so easy to put up a monorail, poles in the ground. You don't have to have the land use for a monorail.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate your comments. Colleagues, without objection, it will be the action of the committee to submit item number 2 to the council for further discussion there. And that brings us to the end of our business.
That is it.
So, afraid so. We can stay if you'd like, but we are adjourned.
No way.
You're on your own.
Yay.